Welcome to the MAM Journals. Today I'm going to be talking about the Z650RS. This was launched in September 21 and it met a good reaction, although muted in some regards, because this bike is obviously what's called a retro bike, reflecting bikes of yesteryear. And the original Z650 was fitted with a 4-cylinder engine rather than the twin that is fitted to this one. I've been looking forward to riding it for some time, and Greenham Kawasaki very kindly have lent me this bike while my own Z900RS is in for service. What we're going to do today is, to help you get a feel for the bike, I'm going to do a technical walk round. We'll talk about the engine, we'll talk about the chassis and suspension, we'll talk about technology, that bit won't take long, and we'll be talking about aesthetics and finish. I'll then be showing you some GoPro footage and how I found it to ride the bike and what it was like out on the road, and then we'll be coming back here and doing a concluding comments and remarks with my opinion and my experience of the bike. I hope that you enjoy the video. When I do a technical walk around, I like to start with the engine, as I think that's the sort of heart of a bike. This engine is actually a bit of a parts bin raid in that it's the same engine that's fitted to the standard Kawasaki Z650. This is a 649cc liquid cooled parallel twin. It's fitted with dual overhead cams and 8 valves. It produces 66 brake horsepower at 8,000 revs and 64 newton meters of torque at 6,700. If I just give you a comparison, if I may, on how that would compare to something of a similar price from Suzuki, the Suzuki 8S produces 82 brake horsepower and 78 newton meters of torque. That may not sound much when you just sort of gloss over the numbers, but that's a 22% difference, and it does affect how I feel about this bike. In terms of dimensions, I mean, the bike I would describe it as a sort of middle of the road. Obviously it's an upright naked. It's 820mm seat height, which is good for somebody of my size. I'm 5'8", and I found that very comfortable in terms of the scale and dimensions. It's quite a small bike. I think taller riders might notice the fact that it is quite petite. It's got a 1,405mm wheelbase, i.e. contact point to contact point on the wheels, and at the front end there it's got a 24-degree rake, which in theory would make it quite a quick steering bike, and I'll touch on more on that when I cover the riding sector and the GoPro. It's a fairly conventional looking bike because obviously it's a retro and it's designed to reflect bikes of yesteryear, and you can see that in the front forks with this. They're not upside down, they're conventionally positioned forks, and there's no adjustment on that as standard. They are what they are. The rear is quite a nice tidy link, it's almost direct in there, but again there's no adjustment on that unit other than preload. It's called a backlink single damper. In terms of braking, at the front end it's got 2x300 semi-floating with a dual piston and those Nissan calipers, and at the rear it's got a 220mm single piston caliper. The bike is fitted with 17-inch wheels, and I'll talk about the tyres in the riding sector. The bike overall weighs 187 kilos, which is actually, for modern bikes, it's quite a light bike, bearing in mind it is liquid cooled. And to give you a comparison with that, the Z900RS, its bigger brother, is 210 kilos, and I mentioned I had one of the original Z650s. That, interestingly enough, was 211 kilos. Okay, let's talk about the technology on the bike. In fairness, as I sort of joked earlier, it won't take long because there isn't much of it. There's no traction control on this bike, but I think there's a a fair argument to say with 66 brake horsepower, do you really need traction control? It's got no engine modes, and it's got no quick shifter. Although it's got nice gearbox ratios, and again I'll touch on that a bit later. These are very traditional tiles. Personally, I think whilst I like the shape of the dials, because that's a good styling take back on the original models, I'm not sure that I'm ever so keen on these blue inner circles, but that's very, very subjective. It's very clear to read and easy to read when you're riding the bike, and they've got this nice LCD digital view in the middle, giving you various levels of information. The way you get to that is via these dials. I like the switchgear. It's nice and simple, straightforward, easy to operate when you're riding, but you just cursor through if you want any additional information. This bike's done just under 1,850 miles last trip, so you got various trips on there. That's what I did yesterday on the bike, just to get a feel for it. I've still got 40 or 50 miles to go, and it's doing 67 miles to the gallon, so it's quite fuel efficient. In terms of finish and sort of aesthetics of the bike, I particularly like this candy emerald green, and you pay a little bit extra for it. I think it's £150 for that green colour, and it's actually really does sort of capture the spirit of yesteryear, because I think in 1977 they did one in this colour as well, so that's a nice touch. Other colours are available. They do metallic spark black as well. The candy emerald green is 8,000 in the UK, £8,099, whilst the spark black is 7,949. So they're not a cheap bike, but you obviously, I think there are, in terms of finishes, I think it's very nicely done. I do like the quality of the paint on these bikes. I've had a couple of Z650RSs, and they really do clean up well. I like the fact this is nice even seam along here, beautifully done. I think the frame's nice. It's not got, you have to weld a frame, that's how it works, but I mean they've done it nicely. I like the nice matte finish on it. I also think when you look at the engine with this black finish, it's good. This bike has been used, it's a working bike. It's a demonstrator from Greenham, and I'll say I'm grateful for them for lending it to me, and they would have kept it clean, but I don't suppose they spent much time polishing it, because it's a busy dealership and they'll want them clean and well serviced, chain adjusted and all that, but they're not going to faff around every 5 minutes waxing in and doing the sort of care that an owner would probably put into it, as it's their pride and joy. But this engine, as I say, I like that engine finish. I had my Z650 was early 80s, were called an F3, and that had black engine finish on it as well, and that used to fall off at the sight of a stone, never mind actually getting a stone chip. So this is, it's bearing up well under the pressures of doing a job. I like the switchgear, which I touched on earlier. I personally really do like this retro styling. It's a bike that I can relate to because of my early experiences with these types of bikes. I like the tank shape. This is a bit narrower than the original, but it still gives that very distinct feel. I do love the torpedoes up here, which actually came out with a Z1 back in 1972. So I mean that's a really nice styling take from my perspective. I like the round headlamp. They could have obviously gone for something more modern, but I think they naturally and understandably went for that more traditional look, which is good. And I personally quite like the beak. Now some people put what's called tail tidies on there to shorten this away, but I actually think that captures the style of the original bikes, which were very long at the back, and you do get a bit less water spray if you ride in the wet, leaving that on. But again, these are personal choices. Things I didn't like about it, I'm not sure about the look and styling and indeed the finish on this exhaust. The original Z650. Obviously had 4 pipes, which I personally think is more attractive, and they were chrome. And that sort of finish is, I just don't think it's as good, but that's a personal opinion, and we can all have those. I do, looking at the design and shape of that, and I always I'm a bit careful about being critical of, some engineers spent months working out how to make it look like that. So I do respect what they're doing. It probably helps with the airflow, but to me it looks like a plumber did it after a bad night out. But that's just how I see it. I do, overall, I like the look and the finish of it. The wheels are very good. The finish on those wheels is really nice. Some of the models out there, if you rub them too hard, the finish will come off. But I've personally got one of these bigger versions, and I found those gold wheels, it keeps really well, and the whole bike cleans really easily. And I always think that's a good thing, because if you want to keep your bike up together, you don't want something that's got too many nooks and crannies that it's difficult to get at. I do actually like, just finally, I do like the overall I like a stubby exhaust, and I do think this part of it is quite nice and tidy. It's just really the headers that I haven't taken to. Having covered the specification of the bike, what was it actually like to ride on the road? The start-up engine note is pretty muted, almost tame, but it does improve as you move through the gears and revs. It immediately feels light and easy to ride, manoeuvrable and precise. Some bikes I ride take a few miles before I am comfortable filtering through traffic, but I had no such feelings with the Z650. The narrow bars, lightweight and small dimensions inspire confidence. For riders that haven't yet had a lot of experience, or those that are a bit rusty, this bike has some very obvious attractions. With no traction control and engine modes to worry about, and uncluttered switches, you just get on the bike and ride with everything coming almost intuitively to hand. It is, as we British say, a doddle to ride. I often go along this particular road, which is pretty bumpy, domed, and with damaged edges and multiple repairs. It helps me initially get a feel for how the suspension behaves. Not surprisingly, much more expensive bikes with sophisticated electronic suspension copes with it much better than standard units like this, but for my initial low-speed ride through, I thought it was okay. A little reactive, but not overly harsh. I have ridden bikes along here that have been pogoing even at these tame speeds. On bigger carriageways, the bike handled predictably and felt very stable, and with 70 miles an hour, the UK national limit, being achieved at about 5,300 revs. This is nicely before maximum torque at 6.7, so you've got plenty in hand. For regular riding on at these types of speed, I like bikes that have good brakes, that can back you out of any potential trouble, and an engine that can quickly get you past without having to dance on the gearbox, and this does that. The handling felt nicely neutral. You don't have to manhandle it to change direction, nor does it suddenly drop in. It felt comfortable on what I would describe as medium-paced, mostly smooth roads with occasional tight and sweeping bends to liven up the ride. It builds up nicely through the gears, which are easy to select and engage, and as long as you ride methodically, it is a good gearbox. I didn't find much value in attempting to rush it, even if you are pressing on a little. It is quite traditional in that regard. I did try the bike at its higher rev range, and the engine is willing around its 8,000 maximum power revs, but did find myself thinking that if I wanted to regularly ride a bike in this way, the Z650 wouldn't be a natural choice. It's nice to know that you have that option, but other bikes are probably better equipped for that style of riding. I found myself riding the Z in what I will describe as the torque range, i.e. 5 to 7,000 revs, and it felt responsive yet comfortable. I suspect that some owners feel the same. I did feel some vibration through the handlebars, and I initially thought I might actually be holding the bars too firmly, but I could still feel it even with a conscious effort to reduce this. I do think the suspension overall is okay. Personally, I'm not a fan of the original fit Dunlop tyres on this bike, and indeed a few others like it, and I found that you can improve the ride and feel of a bike with softer, more pliant tyre choices. Something to think about if you test ride one and think it's a little stiffer than you would like. I understand, but obviously can't confirm that the top speed of this bike is circa 130 miles per hour, although I suspect to most of us that is purely academic. With a retro bike like this, comparisons to the original are inevitable, and indeed I had an early 80s Z650 F3 which I bought from new. The F3 was a big improvement on my previous 1977 Z1000, which frankly handled like a shopping trolley. I've had two of them and they were actually both the same. Stunning to look at, but about half as fast as we remember them. The new Z650RS is equal in power to my old Z650, but both lighter and with better brakes and suspension. There are, naturally, a lot of rose-tinted views on the old Z650, and memories do play tricks with all of us, although I have to say I do prefer the four-cylinder engine, despite the weight that it added to my original bike. I actually rode the RS along some of the roads that I used to ride my F3 many years ago. I suspect the RS rode them better, if without the sound and feel of a four-cylinder. Overall, I enjoyed riding the bike, more so when I realised and relaxed into its easygoing and capable character. It is not a sports bike, and whilst I'm sure that experienced and faster riders would be able to press on, I'm not convinced that this is its forte, nor do I think the bike is aimed at that market. So what were my conclusions, having ridden the bike and had the privilege of having a go on this for a couple of days? I've got to say my first reactions, having got on the bike, having really anticipated, positively looking forward to riding it, was a little bit underwhelming. The sort of put of that two-cylinder engine at low revs is certainly not particularly inspiring, but in fairness to the engine, the more you ask of it, the better it comes. It's not a sporty bike by any performance, but it is a very agile, light and easy bike to ride. The handling's okay. I like the gearbox. It's not close ratio, so in any shape or form, so you have to be precise. But the faster you go, you still want to be slow with your gear changes. But I did actually enjoy riding the bike. I think one observation really of riding that stuck in my mind is all engines vibrate, and the question is where they vibrate and how they vibrate and at what frequency. And I did find with this particular bike that I was getting a buzz from my hands, which is a bit uncomfortable. Personally, I'd rather the feet buzzed than my hands buzz, but that might just be a personal preference. But if you've got an engine, it's going to vibrate. That's the nature of it. So what's the competition for this bike? Well, in terms of prices, I think, to my mind, there's probably four bikes that I'd be looking at in terms of that £8,000 price step. The new Honda Hornet has been received very well, and that's £7,000 against the 8 of this, and that's got significantly more performance. The Yamaha, the MT-07, is a well-regarded bike, and that's 7,600. And of course the new Suzuki is come out at the same price as this, 8,000 again. All of those bikes, as I say, have more technology and more performance. The other bike I think people might, looking at one of these, might consider is maybe a used Z900RS, which is understandable if you're looking for a bit more power. Now, if you're happy with a more leisurely approach and a nice easy bike and lighter bike to actually sort of push around than the Z900, because some people, that is a consideration when they buy bikes, I can see the appeal of this one. I'm not quite sure that I understand why a bike without any of the technology should be the same price as the one with it all, but that's maybe just a anomaly in the market. I think for me, the real strengths of this bike are aesthetics. I love the look of the bike. It's beautifully finished and it is so easy to ride. Personally, I would go for a Z900RS, but I respect the fact that some of you might say, well, actually, I don't need 109 brake horsepower and I don't want the weight. I'd rather have this. I do hope that you found this review useful and that you've enjoyed watching it. If you have liked it, you might want to press either like or even consider subscribing to the channel. But anybody who knows me knows that I don't worry about that very much. What I most would say to you is ride safe, stay well.